Glad to be here. I'm going to tell you about my exciting project, and thank you, by the way, all the previous presenters for sharing their love affairs with their particular frameworks. So I'm the original author of AngularJS, but now we have a team of a few more people. There's about a team of 6 of us working on this, so I can no longer take credit for all this stuff. But I wanted to, I'm going to go quickly through a couple of slides at the beginning because we only have half an hour, and I wanted to spend about half of the presentation doing some demos, because I think people like demos, right? Big fan. Okay, how many of you guys, thank you. How many of you guys have used AngularJS before? Okay, good shows of hands. Thank you very much. So yeah, browsers started long, then we got better, and then we could do IDEs. Sorry, I'm skipping going fast, but the current state is that users are pretty happy with the web apps, but the developers aren't. And if you say that developing for web browsers is an awesome experience, then I want to talk to you because I want to drink what you're drinking. And the reason is that complexity kills. And why is that? Well, browsers are really designed for static pages. And they excel at it. I mean, they're really amazingly good. You want to say hello world. This is as simple of a hello world as you're going to get. You put a bunch of p tags around it, which means it's going to be a paragraph, and it's going to render. And this is just, you know, I can't think of a shorter hello world than this.
You don't need the p tags.
You don't even need the p tags. OK. But compare this. I don't think it would be HTML. I think it would be a text file at that point. But that's OK. So compare this with the equivalent JavaScript hello world. And this is the opposite extreme. This must be the most complicated hello world there is. And also keep in mind that there's a lot of knowledge you have to know about how the browsers work, how the event system works, and how the whole thing gets bootstrapped. And it's just too much to deal with. And so I feel like developing for browsers is black magic. And I feel like I'm tricking the browser. How many times have you been like, I want to do X. Now, how do I trick the browser to do X for me? You get that feeling? And remember how you tricked the browsers into doing border radius before there was border radius? You chopped up the images and put tables and things. And so this is the kind of thing we have to do with applications. Browsers natively really don't do applications, and it really feels like tricking it. And so what we want to do with Angular is, for lack of a better term, we call ourselves framework. But what we really try to do is really try to say we're actually a better browser. And let me demonstrate why that is. But then before we get there, you're going to say, well, what about jQuery? Isn't jQuery just amazing? And it is. I believe nobody has done as much for the web as jQuery and John has done, the author of jQuery. But if you think about jQuery for a second, you realize that jQuery shouldn't exist. If the browser vendors got their act together and they were consistent and they had a good API, there would be no need for jQuery. And the other thing about jQuery is that it's imperative, meaning that you have to execute it in order to know what the result is. And the reason why the original Hello World was amazing is because it was declarative, that I could just say what I want and I got what I want. So Angular is all about declarative way of expressing yourself. And so we want to do something like this for the application. And the answer to that is data binding, and we'll talk about that more. So data binding is spreadsheet-like updates. We got a theme of superheroes, so that goes through all of our releases, etc. So if you have a spreadsheet, if you have a form and you edit the form, it updates the model. And then the model can be bound to a view, and that updates the view as well. And notice this is bidirectional for the forms, and it's a single direction for the views. And you can think of it, the thing you want to take away from it is that the model becomes a single source of the truth. You don't query the DOM, you don't update the DOM, you don't talk to the DOM. It's irrelevant. DOM just happens to be the projection of your current model. But model is the truth. If you want to read what the current state of the form is, you go to the model and say, what's the current state? And if you want to change the current state of the model, you simply go to the model and update the model. So far, this is very similar to the other frameworks. And this is kind of the holy grail that everybody tries to get to. This is some more example that we can do repeating over here. I'm going to skip through this again because I really want to get to some good demos. But I wanted to show you is that AngularJS gives you data binding, and it gives you data binding now. But we also don't just want to say, hey, this is something we do. We actually want to go to the standards and say, this really should be part of the browser. And so we're working on a spec called model-driven views and a child spec of that called object observe. And what it does is it brings native implementation of data binding into the browser. How many of you guys have heard of model-driven views or object observe? One? Okay, a few of you guys. Awesome. Oh, I see an AngularJS classic shirt, and very nice. So we want to really bring the browsers up to date here, because we feel that unless browsers really fundamentally embrace data binding, there's never going to be an ecosystem where you can take different widgets from different libraries and components and bring them together into a single page and have a good experience about it. So hopefully that's the near future. But speaking about verbose code, when you have verbose JavaScript, what you can do is you can pull it out into functions, and we know how functions work, and we know how we can reuse functions and all that stuff. But it turns out that HTML suffers from the same thing. So if you have, let's say, tab, or the idea of tabs, you can go to Bootstrap. Sorry, I blanked for a second. You can go to Bootstrap, and you can get amazing skin for something like tabs. But then if you want to actually render the tabs, you have to go to HTML, and you literally have to cut and paste this chunk of HTML into your application so that you can have this thing rendered. And I really feel like we're back into square one, where we're tricking the browser into doing tabs, because browser simply doesn't have vocabulary for it. What I really want to do is I simply want to say this. I say I want to have tabs, and tabs are made out of panes. Panes have titles. And it should be as simple as this in order to express yourself, right? This is the goal. And so again, this is something we call components, and you can do that today with AngularJS. And you can have your imagination go wild as to what you could possibly build with this. And the reason why this is important is because it allows you to turn your HTML into DSL, domain-specific language. You can turn your HTML as the thing where you go to and you say, aha, this is how the application is built. Normally, when you look at an app, there's usually this scary main method. It kind of assembles the app. And the bigger the app, the scarier the main method gets. With what we're trying to do with Angular is that HTML becomes a single source of the truth. You simply go to the HTML, you see all the components, you see how they're arranged, and you go, aha, I know how the application is assembled. And so in a good fashion, not only do we bring this to you with AngularJS, we also want standards for this. And this is where web components comes in. This is another standard that is being worked on. Again, this is going to be a native implementation of this feature, and hopefully it's going to happen in the very, very near future. So that's it for my talk, and let's do some demos. By the way, I love questions, so don't hesitate to ask. So this is our Hello World application. Everybody has to have Hello World. And what I like about this is that I really like what you said earlier, what the earlier presenter said about not repeating yourself and being terse, because those are good qualities which allow you to build large-scale application and following conventions and so forth. And so, for example, in the case of a Hello World, well, let me show you that it works. What we want to say is that, hey, there's an input, and whatever the input model of this thing is, we want it to render inside of our data binding. Now, a couple of things to notice. First of all, notice that this is regular HTML. These are not script tags. These are not text nodes somewhere. These are not string concatenations. This is HTML. The second thing I want you to notice is actually that there is no app, because this is so simple that there should be no app. There is no JavaScript per se other than our library.
Delete the O right now.
Delete the O?
Yes. Okay. Answers the question.
Okay. Not sure what the question was. The delete key works as well.
Dynamic.
Yes, it's totally dynamic. Think spreadsheets. Thinking like spreadsheet is a really good way to think about it. But what I want you to focus on is really the HTML. And as I said earlier, HTML is really good about static documents. But we want to teach HTML new tricks. We want to teach HTML how to do applications. So the way I like to think about it is, Angular is what a web browser would have been had it been designed for web apps. So the way you bootstrap yourself is you simply do ng app. You simply say, this is my application. And wherever you place this inside of your HTML document, everything underneath it now follows the rules of Angular. The other thing is that everybody already knows HTML, and so there's no need to learn anything new, but we're extending the vocabulary of HTML with these ng dash prefixes. So in this case, we're saying there's this ng model. In other words, everybody knows what an input already is, and it behaves just like you would expect. But the thing we're doing is we're taking the model and putting it inside of your JavaScript heap rather than inside of the DOM, for which you can have to get a reference to and then read it out. Now, not only can we do this, but I wanted to show you. OK, here's the same Hello World application. I want to show you a little bit of debugging trickery here, because I think that makes a great demo. First of all, we have an extension for the browser so that it actually understands AngularJS applications to help you with it. But I want to do this manual way because I think it's interesting. First, let me show you the HTML. As you can see, this is a standard HTML that we saw earlier. And so one of the tricks, I don't know if you knew about it in Chrome, is that if you click on something like this guy over here, you can do $0, and that gives you a reference to this particular node. So you can say angular.element, get a hold of the node. This is essentially the same thing as jQuery, the $, and we can get a hold of the scope. And let's write this into a variable. And if we expand the variable, and let's put some text into it here. Oops. Notice there is now your name, because your name is the thing that we have looked at. So let's actually look at it more in depth and say your name. And notice that as I type and I look at the your name property, it gets updated. But it also works the other way around. And we can do it like that. But it doesn't update immediately. This is because you've done something outside of what Angular knows about, so we have to give it a little kick. Normally, you don't have to do this. This is usually done automatically, but we're inside a debugger, so we have to do a little bit of extra work. And notice how it gets updated as well. Now, so far, you've seen this with other frameworks, but I wanted to point out something interesting here, is that s.yourname is just a regular property on a regular object. You don't have to go through special getter or setter to access this. And what that means is that Angular doesn't actually have an official model. In other words, a model is just any good old objects that you're familiar with. An array, an object will do a model. If you have an existing library that provides you a model, some kind of object that represents your data, that will work as a model as well. So there's no need to do any kind of wrapping. Let's move on to the next one. So the next thing every application has to have is a to-do. That's an interesting checkbox. And one of the things that we wanted to do, actually, let's go back over here. One of the things we wanted to do, notice again, is that there's no script tags or anything else. It's just HTML, which means that you can open this inside of your favorite HTML editor, and it will parse as expected. We added vocabulary, for example, controller. And the best way to think about a controller is that simply it's code behind the DOM. And the reason why that's the way to think about it is that, for example, there's an archive method which removes items that are already checked. So if I add an item here and I archive it, that particular item gets removed. And so simply referring to an archive method, you can call it. Now, I'll show you what an archive method is. But before that, I want you to look at the code. This is the controller. And notice there's actually no API that we actually expose to you. There's no API to learn. There's no classes to extend. There's there's some conventions to follow, but really there's nothing from Angular that leaks into your application. And we think this is an important point because we're not forcing you in any way. And this is why I like to say that Angular is not really a framework. It's more a better browser. This is really how, if you think about it, this is how a browser should have been done from the very beginning if browsers were designed for web applications. Any questions so far? Yes?
Why are all of the Angular attributes in the HTML prefixed with ng?
Why are all the attributes prefixed with ng? Because I think ng sounds like Angular, but it's short. No? ng? No, it doesn't sound like Angular, you don't think? There's no other reason other than we wanted to kind of make it clear that these are extensions of Angular. And so if third parties write other extensions, they should have other prefixes. Now, a lot of people complain that they would like to see data dash, and you can very much do that. So if you really want to run this through an HTML validator, you can put data dash ng dash model, and that will work just fine as well. So actually, you bring up a very good point, which is we have these extensions to HTML, but here is the kicker, which I think separates Angular from the other frameworks. And really, I really don't like the word framework for Angular. The better word would be Angular is actually a meta framework, because Angular allows you as a developer to come up with your own set of tags and your own set of behaviors and your own set of vocabulary that you can then graft on top of a browser. So yes, Angular comes out of the box with these things we call ng dash, whatever, what have you. But there's a whole other things that you can imagine this thing doing. So for example, there's a project out there called jQuery Angular UI, and they give you standard things like tabs and integration with Bootstrap and so on, and all through just simple extensions to the HTML. Okay. The other thing we like to do is if you have a large-scale application, you need to do things like routing. You need to do things, the standard things, routing, deep linking, having views, talking to the back end. And one of the things that we really focused on is we want to make sure that we embrace HTML, CSS, and JavaScript rather than abstracting it away. There's been attempts in the past to basically look at this particular problem of building web apps and saying, well, the problem is HTML, CSS is complicated. We'll just abstract it away from you. And these abstractions never quite work in corner cases. That's when they break down. And so what we really focused on is we wanted to embrace them. So typically application has a Chrome, and there's the ng view, which basically says this is where the individual pieces go. You can declare a route. We can go more in-depth in it, but this basically is your URLs. It will say what controllers and what templates are being used for this particular route. But here is something interesting. The way you navigate to a particular subroute is just an ahref, right? Normally, if you had an ahref in your application, clicking it would take you to another page. And so in most frameworks, the way this is done is you get a hold of the particular item and you register a click listener on it. And then when you click on this particular thing, you have to remember somehow to update the URL so that you have deep linking going over there. And there's a lot of frameworks that help you tremendous amount with it. But the difference in Angular approach is that we really wanted to embrace what the web already does, what you are already familiar with, which is, well, ahref already does the navigation. It already does deep linking. It already does all the right stuff. And so we just wanted to bring it in the same exact spirit into the application. So when you're building an Angular application, it very much feels like you're building a similar application to the round-trip server-type applications where you have views, you have controllers for those views, you have routes, except everything executes on the client. And as a result, it's very responsive, very fast, and you get the bookmarkability out of the box and other things. The other thing that I wanted to point out about Angular, which I think is unique, is that it has dependency injection. Dependency injection is an interesting thing, which, whenever I look at demos of other frameworks, I'm always curious, how do you bootstrap yourself? How does the app get assembled? And usually there is some interesting process by which the application gets assembled. But in Angular, actually, there's no such thing. There is no main method. There is no one place where you kind of say you kick it off. The closest thing we have to a main method is the ng app directive that kind of says get going. And the interesting thing about that is that because you don't have any main method, the application simply assembles by introspecting on the controllers and says, okay, so I see that you're in a particular route, in this case a slash route. I see that this requires a list controller. The list controller simply goes in and says, well, I need a scope and I need a project. And the Angular says, well, I don't know what a project is, but later on, we declare what a project is. And the project says, well, in order for me to be instantiated, I need something called a resource. And notice how the application just self-assembles, just simply by trying to instantiate things and following what you need in order to get your job done. The app literally self-assembles. And as a result, there is no main method. There is no place inside of our application, inside of the code base, which assembles the application. Now, that has a very important side effect for testability point of view. So in my previous life, I was an advocate for testing. I don't know if you guys read some of my previous blogs on this. And so I feel very deeply about having a good testing story. And to me, it's not just a testing story in a sense that you should test and you should be a good citizen and should do it, but I feel like as a developer of a framework, it is my responsibility to provide you with all of the tools to write good tests out of the box. So Angular out of the box comes with a unit testing story, an end-to-end testing story, mocks. And the whole dependency injection comes into a great advantage because what you can do is you can assemble the application with components replaced. So inside of your tests, you can say, well, instead of talking to real backend server, I want to mock out communication channels so I don't actually have to do HTTP requests and responses. And you can do this relatively easily with Angular simply by overriding the HTTP service. And then you say, well, give me this controller. The controller assembles in a normal fashion like it normally does, but it gets a fake backend. And then in your side of your test, you can test this. The other thing you can do is you can do end-to-end tests. And with end-to-end tests, like Selenium, suppose you click on a button, you don't know how long to wait before the server has responded and give you back a response. So typically you do either some kind of pulling or timeouts or something of that sort. Angular actually has a runner, end-to-end test runner, which is integrated with internals of Angular. And so when you say click, the test runner knows exactly how long to wait before all of the responses come back, and you can continue executing to the next particular point. Other questions so far? Yes?
In your rel provider here, you say like when the URL is such and such, go to this page. Is there a way to add conditions, like saying if you're logged in, you go here, but if you're not logged in, you go somewhere else?
So the question is, can you add conditions when you're logged in? Yes, you can do that in a lot of different ways. I don't really want to get into it in here, but you can catch me afterwards. There's events you can hook into. You can hook into the HTTP service, and because of that dependency injection, you can actually go a lower level, and at any point in communication, you can redirect to the login page. And somebody actually did a very good blog post on that. So let's talk about components for a second. One of the things about components is, here's an example again with what a component looks like. You have, again, pure HTML. Again, you have a body and you have tabs, right? Browsers do not understand tabs. Out of the box, this is meaningless. And similarly, out of the box, the pane is meaningless, and so is the title attribute. But what we can do is, as I said, Angular is a meta framework. What you can do is you can declare your own components. And so in this particular case, you're saying, well, if you come across a tab inside of HTML, here is what I want you to do. And first of all, there is the scary-looking piece of HTML that needs to get replaced for rendering purposes. This basically comes from Bootstrap. But more importantly, there's behavior that goes with this thing. So not only are we saying this is how something renders, I'm also going to add behavior in terms of what it should do. But notice the component itself has full-on data binding and events. And so instead of implementing the component through through registering click listeners, you can simply use what you already are familiar with in Angular, which is clicking, having data bindings, and so on. Similarly, you have a pane, which is another component, which simply wraps the content in a div. And then the pane then communicates with the tabs in order to add itself into the component. Now here's where this really starts to shine, is that suppose we have a controller called ngRepeat, and you wanted to add multiple panes dynamically. Because ngRepeat adds whatever happens to be inside of it, if it happens to have panes, it automatically adds more panes into your page. Yes?
I sound like a dinosaur saying this, but I still use XML and XSL.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And
gravitating to JSON. I get a lot of my data in JSON, and I actually go to the trouble to translate it to XML, to translate it with XSL in order to put it to generate HTML.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm looking at this, and I'm saying you're bypassing all of that by having a native data binding
Yes.
that looks very much like my XSL.
Probably,
would that
yes.
be a way of
You know, if you squint hard enough, everything looks like everything else.
Well, my eyes are going, yeah, so I have to squint a lot. Yeah.
Okay. So this is kind of all I had. How are we doing on time?
But I see some parallels here. Would you agree that this is basically just making it more natural so that
Yes.
whatever sort of data you have, you can transform into your view?
Yes. So I think I covered everything I wanted to cover. There's also a little bit of localization in there as well. Thank you, by the way, for coming. Really appreciate it.